session is the kickoff for the fiscal year 2021 budget season. 'Tis the season. We'll be covering two important topics today that'll frame the work we'll be doing to develop the city budget when we return in 2020. The first looks forward with the general fund forecast preview from the City Economist. And the second topic looks back with a discussion of highlights from the fiscal year 18-19 prior year performance report. This marks the fourth annual publication of this report by the city's budget office. The report reviews the results of city programs in the context of the previous year's budgetary investments. This year's report is once again organized around the outcomes, which have been consistent, recent priorities for the City of Portland. It features significant areas of success where programs are achieving better results for the community, even within the existing resources that we have. However, we'll also have a chance to discuss how we might overcome continued challenges on priorities like addressing the homeless crisis, achieving racial equity in Portland, and combating climate change. With that, I'll hand it over to Budget Director Jessica Kennard. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Council, for being cozy with us here on a Thursday morning.
Very cozy.
Look, honey, I shrunk the table.
So we're going to briefly just give the agenda, an overview of the agenda. So after brief introductory materials, City Economist Josh Harwood will provide our economic outlook and the initial general fund forecast for the next budget year. Council should feel free to interject with questions during this portion of the presentation. We'll then turn to discussing key findings and recommendations from the prior year performance report. We took Council's feedback from last year to heart, and we have shortened and simplified our presentation. However, the city is undertaking a lot of important work that merits attention, and as such, we will be providing at least one highlight from each of the 7 priority areas featured in this report. So to try to streamline the conversation, at the beginning of the performance presentation, we'll share with you our discussion questions so that you may be thinking about them as we move through the slides, and try to reserve substantive discussion for the end of the presentation. Brief or clarifying discussions, of course, can occur throughout the presentation. So the goals of today's session is to first contextualize the city's current general fund outlook and economic conditions. Second, to understand what the data tells us about key council and city priorities. Third, to recognize and learn from those bright spots that we see in bureau and city performance. And finally, to prepare for budget discussions and refine useful information for council decision making. So with that, I'll turn it over to Josh Harwood.
Okay, a couple of quick contextual things before we get started. I know we always, as forecasters, give you a point estimate about what the forecast is, but in reality, the forecast is a range of possibilities, right? And so our conservative forecasting principles here at the city and in policy mean that, as Commissioner Fish used to always reference, the Saltzman principle is in effect. So things tend to get better as we get closer to actual budget season. They should if we're doing our job right. So so take that into context as we move forward with the presentation.
Could you explain that? Why should the budget situation get better if we're doing our job right? I'm not following.
More often than not. So the further we get away from actually getting a final forecast, there are more unknowns. And so if we're forecasting conservatively, more of those unknowns should be positive than negative as we get as they become known as we go forward.
All right, you're on the record. I'm holding you to it.
That's why I said more often than not. So it's always I'm an economist. We're always caveating things, right?
Always good to have a backdoor strategy.
So with that, we'll move on to the December forecast results. The unallocated resources right now are basically the ongoing. There's basically zero ongoing. There's $100,000 is the way it works out in the forecast numbers. There is about 11 million at one time, a little less than that. A couple of things to point out. The forecast figures do not include potential ongoing labor bargaining costs with open contracts that we have now. It also does not include the mayor's direction in the budget guidance that would swap some one-time for ongoing with the public safety bureaus. And we haven't yet realized some of the PERS savings that may result from Senate Bill 1049. There is a lawsuit pending. This may be one of those unknowns that becomes a known and does actually improve the forecast a little bit as we get further along. as we move and look at sort of the 5-year forecast numbers, there's a couple of things I want to point out, and for Commissioner Hardesty in particular, because I know this is the first time we've kind of gone through some of this stuff. City practice does require that the city balances budget over the entire 5-year forecast. So that means that to the extent the forecasted revenues are not robust enough to cover forecasted expenses in year 5, we pull cuts or pull money back into year 1 to put us on a steady long-term plan. So that's why you see in the bottom right-hand corner of that table in the slide, a 0. So we always try to balance to that number. A couple of changes that we did make, there wasn't a lot of changes to the revenue forecasts. Things have generally gone to script in the economy. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But essentially, the largest change was the recognition and addition of the expected returning taxes from urban renewal areas. As this has become closer in the forecast and become more certain, both in terms of the numbers and the timing, we felt it was appropriate at this point to add them into the forecast. And that's why you see, this is the first time this has happened since I've been here, so this is somewhat unusual. You see ongoing available beginning in 22-23 and 23-24. And that is the result of primarily the River District, at least initially, returning taxes back to returning assessed value of properties back to the tax rolls, to the overlapping jurisdictions. We also incorporated some council-directed changes related to the 311 system and the integrated tax system. These things, things like this usually come up as part of the fall bump, and we add them into the forecast to the extent council directs us to. So let's look a little bit at the risks. I've already talked about the PERS upside risk that's there. Lodging taxes, I think long-term, both with, as we've been told, a more robust convention activity, and clearly the hotel industry believes that Portland's a good long-term play, as we are probably within a matter of blocks of 6 or 7 brand-new hotels. So I think there's about a 30% increase in rooms in the downtown area over a 5-year period. So we will see, I think, some significant upside risk on the lodging taxes over the long term. Short term's a little bit of a different story. Our vendor that we consult with along our lodging taxes will tell you, and as part of the forecast, I do talk to a couple general managers of hotels, just to get a sense of what they're seeing. They're holding room rates relatively steady, but their occupancy rates are falling. The supply is outpacing, new supply is outpacing new demand. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. So lodging taxes for the general fund have flattened a little bit. And there's some unknowns around short-term rentals as well. So that's sort of what we're looking at. The biggest, though, downside risk, I think, is to the telecommunications taxes. I think you've all been briefed about this. The FCC ruling we're appealing currently, there's some exposure to the tune of $10-ish million. We've hedged a little bit in the forecast, but not all the way. So to the extent a ruling comes down that's not in our favor, we could see a reduction in general fund revenues. And then some things could go either way. Business taxes, we've become more and more dependent on a very small number of taxpayers. So their activities can drive up and down. And I'm not getting the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about this, can drive pretty significant changes in the forecast. So, and then with trade and fiscal policy, kind of goes without saying. 3 years ago, after the election, people were asking a lot about what we do about the forecast. What we tell people, or what we've been telling people, and I still think it's true, is that we don't change the forecast a whole lot, but the error bands get a lot wider because it's just a little more unpredictable. It's got a little potentially outsized influence on what could happen. The possibilities are just a little bit broader. So that's where we're at with that. The next slide is something that we've done before. I just wanted to highlight it again because it's sort of exacerbated and gotten even more the case. Our 2 revenue sources in general fund that are clearly sensitive to the economy are business license taxes and transient lodging taxes. They're now a full third of the general fund revenue. And so what that means practically speaking is that when we look at sort of the general fund revenue exposure, we could have a relatively mild recession and look nothing like the Great Recession, but the dollar amounts that we would have to adjust in the budget could be very similar. is the Great Recession, even though the recession itself is a lot milder. So with that, I'll move on to sort of general economic discussion.
So
unless people have
I don't
questions.
want to just skim by that.
I didn't mean to skim it.
This remains really concerning to me. I cannot underscore, and I want to say this on the record, and I hope as many people as possible hear me. This is deep exposure. This is deep exposure during a recession. And I'm very concerned about it.
I completely agree. I mean,
And-
we've highlighted it several times because of that.
Well, and I've been talking about it for a long time, and I just saw Mark Jolin take off. We're not going to have the opportunity to put more of the joint office for homeless services onto ongoing, because we have no ongoing, no additional ongoing. Which means we are now reliant on one-time only. And the one-time only is basically being generated by two of the most volatile revenue sources that we have. Same with the police bureau, same with the fire bureau. So when we hit a recession and everybody is expecting the economy to slow, we're already seeing signs of slowing in the economy, this will drop precipitously. And we are exposed. And we do not have a plan B yet. I know I've told Tom and I've told Jessica to start thinking about what is the plan B, because we need it. So I don't want to just skip by that and tell people things are great. They're not.
I appreciate you saying that, Mayor, because you might remember I have been having this conversation about really what are the core city services and how do we pay for them, right? Because the way we pay for them today just isn't based on what the public expects for core public services. It's based on how much money we can generate, and that's not a good model. So I absolutely agree and look forward to that conversation next year, I understand.
Great. We'll just do a brief conversation sort of about the economic, where we are in the economic expansion. It is the longest modern expansion in U.S. history. We've got 109 consecutive months of job growth, well beyond anything we've seen in the modern economy. And we've done even better locally, and that's no surprise, I think, to everybody here. We tend to do better during economic expansions. We also tend to do worse during recessions than the average city. So we're a little more volatile. And one of the reasons we're a little more volatile is because when you look at that last bullet, we do see some isolated points of weakness. When I say that the economy's sort of gone to script over the last year, I think that's relatively true. We expected things to slow a little bit, and they have. And they have for both good and bad reasons. I mean, one of the reasons they've slowed is simply we can't find workers, and we'll talk about that in a second. So you can only grow so much if you don't have the labor force to do it. And then the other thing, we have seen some points of weakness in manufacturing and agricultural goods in particular with the trade wars. It's hit some of, I think, our local kind of boutique manufacturers in Portland, some of them harder than others. But generally speaking, the economy is still growing. It's slower. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the big R word here in just a second. As we move to the next slide, so again, the metro area job growth is still pretty strong. If you look at this chart, what it's showing is basically the last 20 years of job growth. Coming out of the tech recession, you can see that we get to about 3 to 4% growth in jobs on a monthly basis, a year-over-year basis. And then you see the Great Recession, we dropped at the worst, almost 7%. And then we had that sort of jobless recovery where we were only growing by 1.5% or 2% for a little while. Then we got up to our typical 3.5%. And now we've come back down a little bit and come back down a little bit slower. So again, this is sort of what we would have expected at this point in the expansion. But one thing I did want to highlight as we go to the next slide, there's been a break in the last 2 years whereby the blue bars, the blue kind of shaded area is the metro area without Multnomah County. And the orange area is Multnomah County growth. And so while the county had tended to grow along with the metro area relatively similarly, over the last couple of years, it's actually grown about half as fast. And so there's probably lots of factors that go into this, not the least of which is cost of living. So, we can talk about that some more, but I think this was kind of an interesting break point that we've seen. And it's sort of borne out in some other indicators that we're seeing out there with housing and the like.
Isn't it also the nature of the employers?
A little bit. There's that. I mean, when you look at who's grown the fastest, it's Clark County, for a variety of reasons. One, we've been talking for a long time about the fact that they're more amenity rich than they used to be. So it's essentially a nicer place to live than it was probably 20 years ago. And so it's appealing, for a variety of reasons. Also, the types of jobs that are growing, not all of them are location-based, and so to the extent the tax policy plays a role in people's choices of where to live, migrants in particular, I think it's probably outsized. And the other place is Washington County, and so the big employers have done pretty well. Nike and Intel, in spite of themselves in some ways, have actually done very well on the financial side, and so they've been growing pretty significantly. The next slide is just sort of a broad look at the labor market. So this is the unemployed persons per job opening, and what we've seen for the first time in the history of this, and the history goes back even further than this chart, is that for about the last year and a half, there are more jobs opening than people that are unemployed in this country. So there's always going to be some people unemployed because there's a skills mismatch, but the reality is that there's just not a lot of slack in the labor market. There's demographics that are involved here too, as baby boomers age out of the market. Millennials may not have the same skill profile as those leaving the market. So there's a lot going on, but the point is that the labor market is very, very tight. And so that's also been a drag on growth more recently. One indicator I look at is related to lodging taxes is traffic through the airport. And so this is the year-over-year growth in airline passengers coming through the airport. It's basically been flat, and for the last 6 months or so, it's a little bit negative. Some of that is dealing with the expansion there. There's airlines that are getting squeezed a little bit for gate space, but the reality is that it was slowing before that a little bit. So it's something that we worry about because it combos two things that we've become pretty reliant on. One is tourism dollars, and the other is business investment.
Does that have to do with new restrictions, daily restrictions on immigrants and refugees and that kind of international travel?
I did look at the international travel specifically because that was something that I was curious about. First of all, it's a little hard because international travel is based on where the airline flew from, and so we get a lot of international travel that goes through Seattle or through San Francisco. So it's a little bit hard to see. What I can tell you is I did look at Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles as well, and they're a little bit better than we are in terms of where those are in general.
Do you happen to know, Josh, or I could probably look this up easily, what is the split between tourism travel and business travel through PDX? Do we know?
I could reach out to Travel Portland and
If you
probably
wouldn't
find
mind,
out
I'd
that.
be curious.
Yeah, we can look at that. All right. Okay, thanks. Okay, so let's talk about a recession. I get this question a lot, obviously, and have for a couple of years. When I get it, I sort of facetiously say, well, tell me when the convention center hotel will open, and that'll be when the next recession starts. And I got a friendly note from our former director, Andrew Scott, yesterday, who works at Metro, saying that, and the tagline was just, you need to downgrade your forecast now. And the body of the email was the press release for the hotel opening today. So I think, but the reality is that the hotel seems to be opening in a time when we might be turning, but we think we're doing okay still. And so when is the next recession? Well, I think the answer is not so much when as why would it happen? Recessions, there's a saying that economists use all the time, is recessions, our expansions don't die of old age. There's usually a reason for them to happen. Not usually, there is a reason for them to happen. We are not massively overexposed in any particular industry, nor are we as interconnected as we were, on a financial speaking, as we were prior to the Great Recession. So let's start there. If I have to tell a story of how we get there, I think if I have to tell the morbid story of how we get to a recession in the next 12 months, it's sort of what I call a death by 1,000 cuts kind of recession, where businesses sort of hold off. It's an election year. They're unsure. They kind of say, we're going to wait to decide what we're going to do. The economy kind of stalls because people have already bought their new washers and dryers and their new cars and their new refrigerators, and they don't need new ones again. And there's maybe a slight energy shock or something. Gas prices go up a little bit, and we sort of get to a place where we stall. It's not going to look, or I don't think it's going to look anything like the last recession. Rarely do two recessions look remotely similar, let alone back-to-back recessions look similar. So that would be the sort of underlying theory if we had to get there. Again, though, the underlying data is still relatively good. It's not as good as it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, but it's still relatively positive. Consumers are relatively positive. There was a local, even an Oregon study most recently showed that 50% of Oregonians said they were better off than they were a year ago, and that 60% thought they were going to be better off next year. So that sort of confidence underlies the day-to-day sort of people's perception of the economy.
Josh, can you tell us, or maybe think on it, then tell us at some later date, we're now getting into the wave of baby boom retirements. How will that impact the economy?
Yeah, we've looked at this for a long time. So I think it sort of puts an upper bound on how fast we can grow. So the reality is, and it speaks a little bit to that no slack in the labor market, right? So again, if companies want to grow but can't find workers, then it will necessarily slow down the potential growth of the economy. And so we talk about it as sort of the potential growth is lower than it was.
So I can see how it impacts the job market. Certainly, it constricts the opportunity for labor. That pushes costs up, labor costs up. What do we know about discretionary spending for those who are retirement age?
Yeah,
does it increase? Does it stabilize? What happens?
They tend to spend less. I mean, frankly, but we do have a very large generation coming up behind mine, and they're getting into their prime working years, where, especially given the current job market, they should be in good position to bargain for higher wages, and so that's why I think we're still seeing some growth, even though we've got this drag on the back end.
So when we talk unemployment numbers, we're basically talking about people who were in the workforce and then lost a job or something. I just want to make sure that we are, because when we look at youth unemployment as an example, in the African American community is over 80%. And so I want to be real clear when we talk about the workforce and the unemployment numbers, specifically how that's calculated.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Commissioner. This is often a source of confusion for people. The unemployment rate that's basically published in the newspaper, the one that everybody references, is the number or percentage of unemployed people who have looked for a job in the last 4 weeks and want to work, but haven't been able to find one. That is the headline rate. There are other rates that you can look at that are published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but are not generally regarded as sort of the top line unemployment statistics. There's people who are working part-time but want to work full-time. There are people that are disconnected from the labor market but have looked for a job or had a job in the past but aren't looking now. So that's why we look at things like labor participation rate. So people that are, the percentage of working age folks that are actually in the labor force is actually something that has been a big deal coming out of the last recession, because there was a lot of people that sort of fell out of the labor force because they were long-term unemployed and they kind of gave up looking.
And as we talk about the generation of workers that are coming behind you, what we are starting to understand is that there are different types of people. They aren't people that think it's cool to work 60, 70 hours a week. They actually want to have a life. They want to have some kind of balance. We heard this in police recruitment. I hear this in fire recruitment. It is clear that workers today want a different kind of balance than workers previously may have been focused on. And so what needs to change to make working a more enjoyable experience when the folks who you're looking for have a different mindset of what that should look like.
Yeah, I think, I think we've seen companies adjusting to that. I think, I'm not speaking out of turn, our offices have been adjusting to some of that. I think that other parts of the city have too. And I don't think it's a bad thing in any way. I think that the reality, though, is because of this tight labor market, companies are having to adjust to the preferences of their workers in a lot of ways. And that in the industries that are growing, a lot of times, or in a lot of cases, are industries that, again, aren't necessarily location-based. Portland has the highest percentage of employed folks working from home of any city in the country.
And what is that percentage?
I think it's like 8 or 9%, but I'd have to go look. I haven't looked in a little while, but when I last looked a few months ago, we had the highest percentage of any in the country. And so it's and that's a metro area kind of designation. So, but that's the reality now. I mean, if you're a software engineer, in most cases, you can work out of your house, even if you work for a big tech firm. And so and that's why we're seeing some changes in sort of even the office market downtown, right? So it ripples through in a bunch of different ways. So the consensus is still that there's no recession just on the horizon. I think the Washington Post did a poll, and roughly 25% of folks expected one in the next 12 months. I think that's again generally the consensus. It doesn't mean that things won't slow even a little bit more, and how that impacts our revenues is pretty sensitive, and so that's something that we're going to watch as we get closer to the next steps that I'll go over right now. The business license taxes in particular, they're still looking pretty robust, but again, it's a very narrow set of taxpayers, and so we're going to wait until we see fourth quarter returns come in and then the returns in April before we get really excited about anything that may or may not be there.
Josh, are there any surveys of economists and economy watchers that goes beyond 12 months? I mean, the reality is the budget we're sitting here to plan today isn't going to come to completion for a year and a half. So, I mean,
So I appreciate the question, Mayor. Yes, as you go further out, there's a higher percentage of folks that will say a recession is going to happen. I think a few years ago, I read a quote where, 4 out of 5 economists said there would be a recession in the next 5 years, and historically there is a recession in the next 5 years.
I was going to say that's a pretty safe bet.
It's always sort of a tough thing. That's why when we forecast, we don't forecast a recession per se, but we do forecast a flattening and sort of return to trend growth in our cyclical forecast.
Yeah, I want to put my estimate, I give you 100% certainty that there will be a recession.
Exactly. Yes, unless you're Australia, right? I think Australia's the last 28 years they've had an expansion.
In theory.
In theory, yeah. And so let's just go to the next steps real quick and sort of lay out what you can expect to hear from me and from our office over the next few weeks and months. The next thing that you will see is in early January, we'll send around a memo regarding the cannabis tax forecast. We are going to treat this similar to the general fund forecast going forward. Our office took over this management of this fund early this year, and we've pledged to do that, and we will do it we have ongoing and one time in the forecast. We will delineate it very similarly. We'll do a 5-year forecast, and I've worked pretty closely with my colleagues at the state to try to get our hands around what is a pretty early industry at this point still. So that's the next thing you will see from us. At very similar time, we will get the actual COLA number. We're forecasting 2.9% now. It'll probably be right around there. It looks like we've got all but 1 month of data, so I'm pretty confident we're not going to be way off. And so that's what I would expect in mid-January. You'll see probably just an email from me about where we are, and we'll send that to our budget managers and contacts too, so that they can incorporate those changes into their budgets. We'll get a forecast update in February. This is where we'll do some revenue updates. We'll have again, a little clearer picture on the business license tax and in transient lodging taxes at that point. And again, we'll incorporate the new COLA figures into this. And that update is what our office will balance to when we come to you with our recommendations around requested budgets. And then again, the final forecast is in late April after the business license tax filings come in. The timing is always a little awkward, but the reality is that we get somewhere in the tune of 60% of our revenues after April 15th. So to the extent we can get as much information as we can before we set the budget, we would like to. And so I'm happy to answer more questions if you have them either now or later. But if not, I can turn it back over to.
What types of workers are the most scarce?
Well, mostly tech, it ranges. So there's one place, it's not on an educational time frame. So in other words, one place that there's not very many workers are electricians. So, and in the construction industry, there's various trades folks that they're really short of. Essentially what happened during the Great Recession is construction stopped, and a bunch of those people went back to school to do something else. And so that's sort of a generally lower education sort of types of jobs and tradespeople that are scarce. And then on the other end, there's still a lot of tech companies with a lot of money trying to hire folks to do software engineering, to do a variety of tech jobs. So it's pretty widespread. Engineers, architects, there's, I mean, short of maybe leisure and hospitality, although even that has some shortages.
I mean, I was going to guess service workers just because the cost of living is so high here, and I know that a lot of restaurants and bars in particular are struggling to fill the back of the house, so.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. It depends a little bit on the very specific nature of that business, of that restaurant or that bar, but absolutely. It's pretty widespread. I mean, when you get this far along in an expansion and you see this many, this broad-based sort of like expansion, you're going to see shortages in all different places.
But we can't just chalk it up to cost of living. There's
No.
other, okay.
No, I mean,
Interesting.
in-migration slowed in the area in the last year, which we expected to. And that, I would argue, undoubtedly has something to do with the cost of living. But you know, we've been talking for a while about Portland used to be a place where you graduate from either undergrad or graduate school and look for a cool place to live, and they move to Portland. People aren't doing that as much, I suspect, without having a job first. Because it's not a place that you can afford to just come and figure it out, as it used to be.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Great, good report, thank you.
I'm sorry, one last question.
Oh, yeah.
So you said that the job growth was in the high income and the minimum wage. And so we're seeing kind of equal growth on both ends of the spectrum, which means that the middle is what?
Well, the middle has grown. I mean, we're coming out of the last recession, we saw very pronounced high-end job growth and low-end job growth. The middle has grown some. I think what we're seeing, though, is that the industries that are growing, there's just not as many of those jobs. So we've sorted out the industries in such that they're very high-skilled and very low-skilled jobs, and that there's not a lot of that mid-range, or as much of the mid-range as there used to be.
Thank you.
All right. So we'll now turn to the prior year performance report. So as an overview, this report is an annual report that our office began producing 4 years ago, as the mayor mentioned. We authored the report, but also take into account bureau input and feedback. We initially provided this report with a bureau-by-bureau analysis. For the past 2 years, we've organized the report instead around large outcomes that have been focal points for council and city investments and discussion. This approach allows for a more meaningful evaluation and discussion around the bigger picture goals that we want to make progress on. The budget process is one significant way that bureaus and elected leaders can influence performance outcomes. This performance report examines the connection between our investments and performance to help our leaders make more data-informed decisions. And then for reference, you see on the last point here, we source data for this report from a variety of locations. So this report addresses 7 key issue areas and begins with an executive summary, which includes highlights for each area. Today's presentation is largely a distillation from the executive summary, so we will touch briefly on each of these sections in the slides to follow. Interested parties here or watching at home can read more findings and more detailed information by reading the sections of interest online at portlandoregon.gov/CBO. Again, as a reminder, so we are going to have, we have time after the presentation for discussion. Certainly, folks should interject if they have pressing questions or a point that they want to make, but I want to be sure that we have time to get through all the materials. So wanted to preview some of the questions that we thought of to have this robust discussion. One of them is, what information do you find surprising or compelling? Are there recommendations that you strongly agree or disagree with? We would really be interested in what additional performance data would you find useful for your decision-making to help us sort of tee up additional budget conversations. So this could be things like where are there gaps in our information, and what types of information would you like to see from bureaus during our budget work session. So you'll recall we have several hours together in the month of March where we talk about different bureaus' budgets, and we try to incorporate performance information. If there's anything that comes to mind that you'd really like to see during those work sessions, please let us know and we can help bureaus prepare for that. And then finally, what are the areas you most want to see performance improvement in the near term? So the next slide is an overview of our total revised budget from last year. For context, we always like to begin our performance conversations with a picture of the relative financial investment in different issue areas. So this is a tree map. It shows the relative size of total resources contained in our different major service areas. For last year, the City of Portland appropriated a net total of $4.8 billion. These are for all of our important services to keep the city running and to address pressing concerns of Portlanders. This includes revenue from many sources. So you can see this chart shows the public utilities comprise the largest portion of the city's budget. Next is the same chart, but only for general fund revenues, which is often a focal point of our conversation since it is the resource that you have discretion over. The total investment last year included $547 million from the general fund. And so you can see here in this chart that the public safety bureaus comprise the majority of general fund resources.
I would love to see that. I'm sorry, Jessica.
Go
I
ahead.
didn't mean to interrupt. I would love to see that broken down.
By
So
bureau?
that, because when we lump them together, it doesn't give us a sense for really where we're investing.
Yeah, and so I can tell you, yes, I can get that information to you. And I can see the largest general fund bureau in the city is the Portland Police Bureau, followed by Portland Fire and Rescue. Okay, so diving into our key priority areas, the first one is achieving equitable outcomes for all Portlanders. So I'm going to turn it over to Shannon Carney, who's our lead principal performance analyst in the city of Portland. This document was actually her brainchild 4 years ago, and she has been leading the project ever since, and I am immensely grateful for her work on this. So I'm going to turn it over and have her lead a few of these slides.
Perfect. Thank you, Jessica. So the city's work to advance equity for historically marginalized groups is urgent and important, and that's why we're starting with this outcome area this year and talking about the results that we've seen in this area. So as a city, we continued making investments. Oh, thank you. In this work over the course of last year. So one thing I want to note here, you see on the slide, it's a little bit of a, sort of an infographic. And the city has operationalized equity through the Office of Equity since that bureau was established in 2011. In addition, though, there are also now approximately 28 FTE equivalents serving as equity managers or in equity-focused roles across other city bureaus as well, and that's what we show here on the slide. As this institutional support for equity work has grown, one challenge has been centralized, consistent ways of tracking the results that we're trying to achieve. Last year, OEHR trained a cohort of city managers and staff on results-based accountability for equity, and I know you had an opportunity to participate in that as well. So this is, as you might recall, a more data-driven, outcomes-based approach for advancing equity and for tracking equity outcomes. And the Bureau plans to use this framework to track the impact of Bureau racial equity plans in particular. So one thing that we want to see in the coming year, and that the Office of Equity has indicated that they're interested in doing, is identify a short list of shared equity outcomes, so essentially of shared citywide goals around equity to more explicitly link the work that we're doing across the city to budgetary investments in this area. And this will also help the city communicate the work in a way that shows how Bureau bureau projects and work roll up to larger citywide goals.
Shannon, could I ask you a question? The 48 equity-focused performance measures, are those overall performance measures, or are those 48 scattered across different bureaus?
The latter, they're scattered across different
Okay, so
bureaus,
that-
yeah.
I just want to raise that again as a problem.
Right, and that's what we highlighted as well, and that's exactly what we're seeing, is that, well, there are a number of equity measures that we're tracking, and then those are all important, right? But for the most part, those are specific things that each bureau is tracking on their own. There's only a few measures that we're looking at that are more centralized as a city.
And I do understand that in different bureaus, there will be different challenges and different interactions with the public, our customers.
Yeah.
But we now have a bureau, a centralized bureau, and we have staff dispersed throughout our bureaus. And it feels to me like we need more of a clear plan. I mean, what are our objectives and how do we measure success?
Couldn't agree more. So thank you for noting that. Yep.
Okay,
I think
'cause
that's
You know, we've sort of let it slide for a while because it was a new experiment, but now this is part of the institution, it's part of the infrastructure, we're supporting it with significant investments, and we need at least that basic set of information in front of this council.
That's great. Thank you. And this is a lot of why we do this report. I think that going through this exercise for our bureau helps us see what's happening, and so we can bring this to your attention, and then have you help direct us, not just one bureau, but as a city.
Okay.
Great. So the other thing that we note here, there's other cities that do things like they actually have equity indexes and map equity outcomes across the city. So that's something that I think maybe that's a step beyond once we do establish those shared goals and we have a little bit more of a operational framework that we could look towards emulating a city like Tacoma that's working with our community equity index. That's something we know.
And this is probably a further conversation with Dr. Smith, who I think is doing a terrific job. It may require some direction on our part to our individual bureaus to help get us towards some of these more, towards more of a,
Holistic.
thank you,
Yep.
a holistic strategy for the city.
I think that's exactly right. Thank you.
I agree. I think that any 10 people that you run into in a city all have different definitions of equity. And I think people use the word because they know that it's something that's meaningful to this council, but I don't know that they've actually internalized it into their day-to-day work. And so I share the mayor's concern, and I know that we have a fabulous new director who's been trying to pull all those pieces together. So I'm certainly going to look forward to hearing from the Office of Equity and Human Rights about the work that's happened over this year, because we got here about the same time, and I know I'm learning a lot, so I suspect that our new director has also learned a lot in the last year. So I look forward to those conversations as we get further into the budget.
What I'm hearing is some general council interest for these citywide goals, and the equity managers in partnership with the Office of Equity have been doing some really great work. I'm sure they would be happy to take on that charge and get back to
Yeah,
us.
be great.
Great.
Be a good conversation.
So another area that we covered in this report, in this section, is an area where the city has significant leverage to advance prosperity amongst our communities of color. And that's through our contracting and procurement practices, as you know. So last year, here we saw that procurement services actually exceeded its goals on two important performance measures that are related to equity and contracting. That's the percentage of minority and women hours worked on city construction contracts, so that's hours, but then also the percent of subcontract dollars that were awarded to MWESB firms. So you can see that we actually had a 17-point increase in the dollars awarded and a smaller increase in the hours worked. So pretty significant increases on those measures. There was a discrepancy. I just want to note here that the number of contracts awarded to those same firms, to MWESB, actually decreased. So that's something that procurement services is looking into and looking to resolve that. It's a little bit of a reporting discrepancy there. So
Excuse
separate.
me, you
Yeah, go
said
ahead.
women and people of color?
So for minority women and, right, so for the entire firm category.
So it's always helpful for me to have that disaggregated so that we know specifically what communities are benefiting from public dollars and which ones aren't. Because the city likes to lump them together, but it's the disaggregated that gives us real information.
Fantastic. Yep. We can work on getting more of that information. So separately but related are the city's workforce development efforts to diversify the slate of future vendors. And that's through the Community Opportunities and Enhancement Program, also known as the COEP. This is something we also talk about in the report quite a bit. So Procurement Services has been developing this program since its creation in 2017. The COEP is intended to standardize and expand the city's efforts to increase participation of businesses owned by historically marginalized groups in city procurement efforts. And we wanted to note here that establishing a funding source for this program through the 1% set aside of hard construction costs has proved to be a challenge. To the degree that the program structure and the funding model as originally envisioned isn't feasible, we would advocate that other options
Isn't feasible?
to the degree that it is proving challenging. So this is something we talk about and we go into a little bit of detail here in the report, but it's clearly something that Procurement Services has worked on for the last several years. And there's some
Actually say
reasons
we
why.
have not worked on it for the last several years, because this money is supposed to benefit the organizations that the businesses that we are trying to help grow. And this has been putted down the road over and over and over again. So I can't let you
Sure.
just slide through that one.
Sure, and that's why we wanted to highlight here in the presentation today and not just in the report. So I appreciate the comment.
let me
Yeah.
just give you a quick update.
Sure.
The council's going to get a more thorough update in the near term, and I don't see Kimberly here, so I'm going to wing it. Everything I'm saying is with an asterisk, subject to change. But we now have the structure that we've agreed on, and Tom has participated in this process. So Chief Administrative Office, Prosper Portland, and Work Systems now have a consensus on the structure. They understand the urgency, and it's my understanding that council will approve the disposition of the funds, that within 8-ish weeks, we will actually have the RFP out to the community for them to be able to apply for the funds, and funds will be going out the door within 12 weeks of the council's approval. And I believe we filed this on Tuesday, and unfortunately, Kristen had to get up and leave. So I share the urgency. Another of the concerns that you highlighted was how much of the funding would be captured by administrative overhead. And Kimberly indicated to me that of the $1.3-ish million that currently isn't available in the fund, they'll only be using about $130,000 for the administrative overhead between all of those different agencies that are involved. Does that capture the conversation we had the other day, Tom? Okay.
Except about how we're going to pay for it now?
So for details of the program, we can call up others. I think the purpose of our report, so what we sort of focused on is the fact that there are a variety, initially, there were a variety of funding sources that were considered. We were thinking broadly, I believe, about all potential construction costs. And we most recently had a couple of city-issued bonds, large projects for 4th and Montgomery and for the Portland Building Project, that we were able to set aside a portion of those resources in cash towards this type of effort. But what we have since discovered is our legal counsel that advises us on our bonds and other sort of tax-exempt policies advise us that GO bonds in particular would not be eligible, an eligible source for this pool of resource. So then that sort of threw a little bit of a wrinkle in the conversation and thinking about what are we going to do around those types of projects, does that change sort of what we had assumed about this program? And I think actually the folks that have been working on this have wrestled with that question, and I believe have come to a decision as they are bringing something forward to council.
However, this is the prior year performance report. Everything you said is accurate as far as this report
For
is
last year-
concerned.
for this
But
year,
I
yes.
just felt it's important to say that it is being addressed.
That's great. Okay. So then our next section is going to go into some of the performance results that we saw around the city's response to homelessness. So I'll let Jessica take that
Yeah,
on.
so undoubtedly, of course, one of the city's biggest priorities over the past few years has been finding ways to effectively respond to the needs of people experiencing homelessness or at risk of experiencing homelessness. So we set this section aside as its own sort of focus point. You know, a lot of this material won't necessarily come as a surprise to you. Again, looking at the prior year, you've probably heard a lot of it before, but we wanted to just reiterate some of the key points that we found. So last year, the Joint Office exceeded key performance targets by significant margins, preventing over 7,200 individuals from becoming homeless and placing over 5,700 individuals in permanent housing. So what you're seeing in the chart is the light bars are the actual numbers of people served, and the dark bars are the targets. So it's pretty rare that you see targets exceeded to that degree. In all, total of 37,000 people were provided with prevention and housing placement services through a total budget of $71.5 million. And so this actually included a record level of funding from the city's general fund. It included $32.5 million in City of Portland General Fund.
What was the total? Sorry.
71.5 million was the total budget, and 32.5 was city general fund.
And can you remind us how much of that is one-time dollars?
I believe the one time is approximately 7 million.
Thank you.
And we've been whittling it down,
Yeah,
but it's still huge exposure.
that's right. So this performance was an overall increase in the number of people served from the prior year, and housing placement and prevention numbers exceeded the targets by 28% and 44% respectively. So we started this initial push, I think it was in 2015, we declared a state of housing emergency. And there was an initial system expansion goal that we have since achieved. Portland continues, however, to be confronted by unmet needs in housing and housing support services. This is not news to you. The 2019 point in time count, which took place last January, reported that over 4,000 people are experiencing homelessness, which was a slight decline from the last count, which was 2 years ago. But this also included an increase in our chronic homelessness and an increase in our unsheltered homelessness. So what do we do? What's next? I think, you know.
So, excuse me, Jessica, I just want to stop and absorb that for a second. So we've exceeded our measurements as far as assisting folks who are houseless, but yet the numbers are getting larger, kind of across the board is what I heard you say.
So according to the point-in-time count, the number of people experiencing homelessness had actually decreased slightly, but the number of people that were experiencing chronic homelessness increased. And so part of this is there's a challenge that's experienced that tells us the point-in-time count tells us some important and valuable information, but it clearly doesn't tell us the whole picture. So one of CBO's recommendations is that we need to redefine what we mean when we talk about meeting the unmet housing need. If the point-in-time count isn't the right measure because it's not capturing all of the people that we should be thinking about and that we should be serving, then we have to better define that and start tracking how we're doing on sort of those larger goals in that larger population. So our recommendation is that we really continue to reassess the assumptions that are underlying our local approach to homeless services, and we determine together what the next step goals should be that will guide sort of our next phase. We've done a substantial amount of work. The Joint Office has been phenomenal in ramping up their services, and the city and the county have stepped up and really provided a lot of resource, and now we need to sort of look towards what the next phase is. In addition to looking at better defining sort of what we mean when we talk about the unmet housing need that we're trying to address, we suggest that we look more closely at the duration of service and improving retention. So what we've noticed is that originally the Joint Office predicted that 15% of people would return to homelessness after receiving services, but that number in actuality has been between 26 and 29%. There are a whole host of reasons for this. I think the Joint Office most frequently would point to the fact that cost of living is so much higher than what we thought it would be. The cost of housing is so much higher that it makes retention in housing that much harder. So I think we need to look at what's reasonable in terms of how long we're expected to provide services to people in order for them to retain their housing. what that looks like, what that reasonably would cost. And then also just look again at what's a reasonable assumption in terms of retention, and how can we crack that nut. Also, something that we've been talking about, I know here, but that our office would encourage us to continue doing is looking at ways we can coordinate service across sectors. So this is aligning efforts of traditional service providers with other public health and safety entities. This was not a central focus of the original Home for Everyone plan, but it's definitely critical to addressing the needs of the growing population. And we've already seen some of that movement with some of the initiatives that you all are leading and that the Joint Office is leading. So looking to our next steps includes, looking at our next slide as well, includes sustaining efforts to align the work of traditional service providers with public health and safety entities. Addressing the potential health and safety issues also impacts both campers and neighbors, and that's a clear challenge. Last year, the city received 35,000 reports. So what you see here is the dark line in this chart are the number of reports that come in through our one point of contact system, reports of active campsites throughout Portland. I should note that the number of campsite reports received may have duplicates in it. It's not necessarily, we're not counting the people that are calling, and so they might be, or the campsite that they're calling about. So there could be duplicates in it.
And I think it also includes car camping.
I would need to speak with the program
Okay.
folks
I mean-
but I will get back to you on that. If that includes campsites, car camping, the RV
That's-
program.
That seems like a weird way to describe it. People sleeping in their cars. Car camping sounds like fun.
Yeah,
It's not fun to live in your car.
excellent point.
And I know a question for the Joint Office would be around whether there are peaks with organized community efforts, right? Because, sometimes communities just decide they go on next door and say, call the police, right? Because we've got these folks outside. So it's hard to judge, what's legitimate, there's a concern, and what's, we just don't want these people in our neighborhood.
Yeah, and so the Homeless and Urban Camping Impact Reduction Program, which is a long acronym that we call HUCCRP, they have developed a risk assessment tool. And so when they get these calls in, they actually run it through a risk assessment tool and see which of these they would really prioritize in terms of providing having a health and safety risk. And those are the cleanups that they prioritize. And so this tall, dark bar also includes a number of reports that would not qualify for cleanup under that risk assessment.
Ah, okay.
So can I ask you a couple of questions? So is this performance report, is this internally facing for us? Is this externally facing for the community? Who's the audience? Performance report for who?
So we would like to use this as a tool to help you as decision makers, to inform your decision making and to help inform Bureau's decision making around budget. It also, as with all of our materials, is a communication tool that is open and available for the public and
Okay,
the
so
community.
here's our challenge for the coming year. If I went out to any group today and said, we have achieved or exceeded all of our goals around homelessness, I would be booed, and I would probably have to run as fast as I could possibly run, because I don't think the community would agree. So I do not believe we have the right metrics. And I think we also have to be very explicit that a lot of these charts are focused on one portion of our intervention into the homeless crisis, and that is our specific partnership with the Joint Office of Homeless Services and A Home for Everyone. And I always describe that as the compassionate, science-based social service approach to ending homelessness. So that's the prevention, shelter services, transitional services, and the work the county does around mental health and addiction, intervention, and other stuff. And so that's one component of it. And then when you talk about HUCCRP, that's the livability component. And a lot of people in the community, when they think about homelessness, they're thinking about that piece. They're assuming we're doing the compassionate, science-based social service approach, but they're looking at a totally different set of factors. How many camps am I seeing? How many, people are living in the parks? Is there trash piling up that needs the city's attention? Are there needles that need the city's and the county's attention? And then you have the third component, which is safety. And we hear a lot as commissioners about safety. And then there's the housing component, because a lot of the work that the Housing Bureau does, particularly the work they're doing around SROs or the work they're doing around permanent supportive housing, is directly linked to the chronic homeless plan through the Joint Office of Homeless Services and a Home for Everyone. And so I feel like we need to somehow figure out how to talk about, because the homeless situation is created by so many factors and it manifests itself in so many different ways that the community is pretty savvy about understanding. I feel like we need to be a little more expansive in terms of both how we talk about it, how we communicate it, and how we measure success. Because what we have now is sort of the McDonald's model. We serve X number of people. That's interesting, but it doesn't get to the core, which is how are you actually, what does success look like in addressing the homeless crisis? And I think one, for example, is how many people are counted as living on the street? And as Commissioner Udaley said, how many in cars? How many students at PPS and other school districts self-report as being homeless? I just feel like there are other metrics that we need to be using in addition to we served X number of people last year.
That's great.
I agree with everything you said, Mayor. I think one aspect that is left out of these numbers is the kind of uncontrolled inflow of people into our homeless population. And that's not simply Portland residents losing their housing and ending up living on the street or in shelters. Our state is failing people with mental health and/or drug addiction, and our regional partners have extremely inadequate services. So I actually hate talking about this in public because I personally believe once someone is here, they're ours. But we know that people are coming from around the region because there's nowhere for them to go. Washington County and Clackamas County have shelter beds, I think that number maybe in the dozens or very low hundreds, and they're family shelters. So it's a really tough conversation, and it can bring out the ugliness that I absolutely don't want to feed into around the magnet myth. But you are trying to survive, of course, you're going to go to the place that's most likely to have the services and resources that you need. So I think this has to be a regional and statewide conversation, and that it's something that the public really needs to understand. And we should be proud of ourselves that we are doing so much, but we can't actually serve everyone in the region or everyone in the state without additional massive investment
That's a
from our
budget
partners.
buster.
That's right.
That was really well stated throughout. I agree with everything you said, and so any solution needs to be a statewide solution and not a local or even a metro solution. It needs to be statewide. So in terms of performance metrics, I know in the pointing time count, they do ask people, how long have you been here? That would be something that I would really like to see tracked over time, so that we can maybe get a handle on and be able to demonstrate, yes, you're welcome here, and people are coming from elsewhere.
Just by way of updated information, Washington and Clackamas County combined currently have 0 year-round shelter beds.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And the good thing is, I'm still on the Metro Policy Advisory Committee and also the League of Cities. I think that other jurisdictions are now recognizing that they have a problem, where 10 years ago, their solution was we give them a max ticket and send them to Portland, literally. So that's it's good. I think there is going to be appetite for a statewide solution, and I think that's what we should be working on. I have a specific question on the cleanups. Well, actually, a couple of questions. It looks like the number of cleanups actually significantly increased under Mayor Weedler's leadership. It looks like it may have gone down a little bit from 1718 to 1819.
Yes, I believe it did. It did drop a tiny bit, and I will get the exact numbers for you. I know it's in our
It's in the
report.
report.
And I don't have the talking point in front of me, but I will get that for you. I know that,
Right, it's about, so last year, there were just a little bit over 2,800 campsite cleanups performed, which was a slight dip from the year before. It was basically status quo
Okay.
from the year before.
Not statistically different. And
Right.
then the other observation I have is in terms of needles removed. If there's 457,000 needles removed and we have 4,000 people living outside, if they're all from people living outside, that would be about 100 people using it daily, using IV drugs daily. And if there's a way to get at that metric and maybe working with the county to find out, I'm assuming that perhaps some of those needles are from people who actually have homes, but are using outside of those areas. So,
And that would make sense. And what metric are you interested in looking at?
the needles.
The number of needles?
the needle, just,
Okay.
do we have any data on, I know we'd have some data on people who self-report to have mental illnesses and drug addictions. That, I think, would be helpful for us to track over time.
Great.
Kristen, do you know if Multnomah County would have any of that data? Is that, yeah, that'd be helpful. Yeah, thanks.
And Commissioner, did I hear in their question about, I'm not sure, I'm not sure if we would have access to any data that show this, but people who are going to the campsites that aren't actually homeless and utilizing that space?
I was more interested in the needle removed, just
Okay.
specifically.
Got it. Okay.
So I noticed that you noted that communication with campers has been an issue with HUCIRP. Is that
HUCIRP,
Is
yeah.
that the right acronym? I love acronyms. I think that's one of the biggest complaints that we hear is how people feel when they are confronted about being campers. Are we getting any insight into how we could improve that process? And do we track to ensure that notices really are put up in the time that they're supposed to be put up? Is there a process for that?
So, yeah, so this is something that, that was noted in the audit on the program. And from our discussions with HUCR, the program has made marginal improvements in this area. So, leaving behind, more contact information, making sure that signs are waterproof. I'm not aware that there's sort of further oversight of if that's happening. I think that's something that the program has stated that they've done. It's a difficult thing, though, right? I mean, this is something that's just by nature intrusive. I think the other key piece is what happens after a camp is cleaned up, and that's oftentimes campers going to collect their things. And so I do know that there's been a change in terms of the facility that's available, and it's a larger facility, and so HUCR reports that they've seen an increase in the amount of property pickup.
And that's good for folks downtown, but not necessarily for folks who are camping in other parts of the city. And I've also heard
Fair
that the contact info is so small. I'm old, so if I don't have
Right.
my glasses, I'm not going to be able to see it. So
Okay.
if there really is going to be an opportunity to engage people in a more humane way, it would be really helpful, I think, just to be asking those kind of questions as we're building the budget for these kind of services.
One area where I think there's been a notable improvement is with the launch of the new navigation team, which launched early in 2019. So that provides outreach and holistic support to Portlanders living in public spaces. And the team works with the HUCR program and other public agencies to address where.
Navigation team, and Is that part of this program?
No, I believe it's related to I would believe related to the Navigation Center, which is
So
a
it's
contracted
through
portion.
the joint office, and the theory behind it is not everybody, there are effectively two navigation centers currently, and there are more navigation-type services being included with the new shelter spaces. So we have the public-private partnership over here in Northwest, and we have the Foster Shelter, which provides navigation-style services. But not everybody is going to want to or be able to go into shelter, so the NAV teams go out into homeless camps, build those relationships, and connect people directly with services. So it's an effort to do the outreach, and it's very effective. On Hucker, I am eager for us to have a work session. I know we're super busy right now, and we have a lot of work sessions teed up. But the Hucker people, I think, are very eager to respond to some of the stuff that's been said about the program that they do. And so we would like to have them have the opportunity to come here and meet with the council and talk about the work they do and how they do it. Because there is a lot of information and sometimes even misinformation out there about what they do and how they do it. And I think it's important for us to hear collectively what they do and ask the questions that we need to ask.
I hope we'll also invite some houseless people who've had experience with that company to come and be part of the conversation, because I really think it's unfair when we just hear one side of the view, the perspective. People are having real experiences on the street that I think should inform our decision-making as well.
Yeah, I think that makes good sense. There's a balance there.
Okay.
Tom, are you helping to orchestrate that, or is that something we should do direct? Okay, or I could get Seraphy to.
Whatever format people want.
Okay, and Seraphy reminded me the procurement policy that we're struggling with as well addresses this question head-on. So that's something we need to take a good look at as well.
So although we don't have data highlighted in this presentation, I want to acknowledge, of course, that there are several other bureaus that actively work on this issue area. So this includes the Bureau of Transportation's Derelict RV program, which is featured in the report, as well as activities provided by park rangers, Bureau of Environmental Services, Water Bureau, and others. So this really is an issue that many, many bureaus are working on.
I'm sorry, not all of us got copies of the prior year performance report. Are there any extras?
Yes.
Or Commissioner Fritz needs one, and I can share with the mayor if we don't.
And I certainly think that there should be an opportunity to actually figure out collectively, what is the investment the city of Portland is making in houseless services annually? Because as you mentioned, there are other bureaus that are spending different parts of their budget on addressing houselessness. I know some of my bureaus spend some time on houseless issues. I would love to know what the combined total of resources we are investing and providing for people both on the street and for very low-income people and helping them get into permanent housing.
Great.
Because I think we would all just kind of fall out of our chairs with that information. It is a lot, but we're doing it so piecemeal, I think, that we don't have a full picture of the investment that we're making. And so then the next question becomes, if we're investing this many dollars in staff resources, is there a better way to do what we're doing?
We can get some information to you on that, Commissioner. We've done some initial looks in recent times. We don't have an updated number, but I think we have one that's about a year or two old.
Yeah, the last time we did that assessment was for a Gator session in 2018, so.
Government
yeah.
accountability,
Sorry.
transparency. and response.
Performance management, a performance management meeting. Yeah.
Chop, chop. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so on a related topic, we pulled apart in the report our response to homelessness and a section that we're calling Building Shared Growth for a Change Portland. This contained an evaluation of housing strategies as well as complete neighborhoods as we look to adapt to rapid population growth while also preserving and enhancing our sustainability and equity goals. So this is sort of the concept of moving towards, we know that growth in the past is often inequitably felt. So so it's addressing two issues, really. It's how do we respond to changing needs of Portlanders, but how do we make sure that we're growing responsibly and equitably, and we're keeping our goals in mind as we adapt to this changing population. So the report features information on a couple of different areas, but for the purposes of time, we are just focusing on an affordable housing slide. So this also, I don't think, is news to the council, but we have continued to invest mightily in affordable housing development. And new affordable housing units are coming online at record highs. So last year, we had 878 new units that opened last year. But even still, similarly to the homeless challenges, prior analysis estimated that we need to produce an average of 1,800 affordable housing units each year through 2035 to meet our anticipated population growth needs.
I'm sorry, how many per year?
1,800.
Oh, is that all?
So this gap is, but it doesn't, as with other issues, and Commissioner Harsey always likes to see the data disaggregated. This is not, the gap isn't the same at all income levels, right? The need is not the same at all income levels for housing. This gap is particularly pronounced for households earning less than 30% of median income. And so this also gets to some of the, it's the lowest income, but it's also those supportive housing needs that we've talked about before on council. So Mayor and Housing Bureau recently announced 9 new projects expected to put the city on track to meet or exceed the Portland's affordable housing bond goal for specifically this population, 30% AMI and below, and which included also 313 permanent supportive housing units. So that will be an important step forward in achieving, if you recall, council adopted a goal of adding 2,000 new permanent supportive housing units by 2028. So securing the units is one thing. If you'll recall, supportive housing requires 2 things. It requires the building, but it also requires supportive services. And securing the sufficient funding for the service and operating and rent subsidy dollars to pair with these new units is really what's going to be the big challenge facing the city and the county over the next few years to meet this goal. The funding gap remains unknown, but it's likely significant. And so CBO just acknowledges this, and to earlier points, says that we cannot meet this gap on our own, and we really recommend a regional solution to try to solve for this issue. In addition to bolstering regional partnerships, CBO recommends continuing to assess the impact of our regulations on development in the rental market. So looking at and exploring solutions like locally based tools like vouchers to buy down housing costs for more households, and continuing to support and assess programs that keep individuals and families in their homes.
Could I make a quick interruption? Because I want to correct the record. I said something that was imprecise, and somebody sent me a text message, and I want to get this information out there. With regard to the shelter beds, Commissioner Udaley was correct that there are family shelter beds in Washington and Clackamas County. There are no government-sponsored year-round adult beds in Washington or Clackamas County. And I just wanted to get that precisely right, so I didn't get a bunch of angry emails from people. So sorry for the slight pop-up digression.
It's still really bad, Mayor.
It's still not great news, is it?
Right, no.
But I wanted to be more precise with what I said. Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor. So as in sort of an extension of the houseless conversation, we were just reiterating some of the challenges and the needs for new, particularly supportive housing funding sources and strategies. So I'm going to turn it back over to Shannon, who's going to walk through the Improving Community Safety.
Did you talk about the Visitors Development Fund and the work the city and the county and Metro did on that?
We did not talk
Oh,
about that.
because that's not last year, but
That-
the good news story is we all voted for and supported the partnership with the Multnomah County folks and the Metro folks to have some of the travel and tourism dollars go towards the services that would pair with the infrastructure we're building for permanent supportive housing. So I'm actually feeling pretty good about that.
Great.
Good. Okay, so I'll take over, talk a little bit about what we covered with the community safety section. So this is a pretty big section. There's a lot of sort of indicators that we can look at in this arena. We talked about crime rates. We talked about perception of safety, which we now have from the 2019 Portland Insight Survey. And then we also talked about response times, which we'll cover here in this first slide, and some other things as well. So one of the big headlines around response time is that though demand for emergency services continued to increase last year, and that's for, Bureau of Emergency Communications, that's for the Fire Bureau and for the Police Bureau, all of those bureaus actually use different approaches to provide faster responses to those calls. And that was something that we found impressive given the demands on those bureaus. So we wanted to highlight one of those aspects here today, and we can talk to all of them. But so the chart on the slide shows just how dramatically the call answering times decreased over at BOEC. It's the average time to answer cell phone calls. It actually decreased by half, from 30 to 15 seconds. And then on the other side, you see the percentage of calls that were answered within 20 seconds hit 77% last year. And that's short of what we're aiming for in terms of the national standard, but it's certainly much higher. It's 11 percentage points higher than the year, 2 years ago. So that change was really driven by two things in our observation and by the Bureau. An increase in staffing levels, certainly, getting closer to full staffing in the EC Operations Center, but also by the Bureau's decision to try turning off the cell phone filter. So, right? So that's the innovation. And innovation doesn't have to be rocket science. It can just be a change in practice that we try out, and if it works, then we can continue doing it.
So technology is not always our friend.
Right.
Exactly. So there were some, it's maybe too long to go into, but some really other similar impressive changes that were made by the bureaus. We highlighted the embedded sergeant from the Police Bureau and how that embedded sergeant pilot was able to redirect, many types of calls that where an emergency response wasn't required. So our recommendation here is just really celebrate this progress, and potentially, as we look towards the evaluation of results, potentially institutionalizing some of those pilot efforts that have helped us reduce response times over this past year. So on the next slide, so another kind of big theme that we saw in the public safety realm was really the nature of the city emergency response is changing. And I know that's something that you as a council have discussed, particularly in thinking about how to design the Portland Streets Response Program. And we see some evidence of that in our performance numbers as well. So with this graph, what you're seeing is that low acuity calls are a growing proportion of the Fire Bureau's workload. So the yellow, I think it's yellow, the yellow band up there, these are other calls. These include false alarms. They include calls where no incident was found. And those represent a growing portion of the workload. Additionally,
I'm going to stop you for a second.
Go ahead.
They also include calls to TriMet to wake people up who are asleep. They include calls to medical facilities to remove people that they don't want at their facilities. So I think this tells a different story about how other entities are utilizing public services for free. And so this is something I want to highlight because the more I ride with my engines, the more I'm on the scene at incidents and activities that are taking place. I become appalled to find out how many organizations see us as a freebie that they can just, we just call 911 and they'll fix it, right? And then that way we don't have to be fully staffed. We don't have to actually deal with whatever the issue is at our location. So I just want to put that on the record that it is, yes, alarms go off and there are other kind of incidents, but my experience and what I'm hearing from my folks is that the issue is much more systemic. And it's something that we absolutely have to deal with because otherwise we have companies using us as their free ride for stuff that we should not be responding to.
Commissioner, do we have data about whether charging a fee for lifts at nursing homes, has that helped?
Actually, yes, I have actually followed up, and of course, our assumption when we decided we were going to charge nursing homes for lift service, because again, they thought fire was their personal lift service, what we thought would happen would be there'd be a reduction in the use of lift services by fire, and instead, what we've seen is a slight increase and people calling because they've done the cost analysis and figured that what they're paying us is cheaper than hiring a full-time staff with benefits.
Oh, so maybe we need to adjust the price?
Apparently, we didn't aim high enough, yes, but we're going to fix that.
This is a great conversation. I just have to stop and appreciate this. So thank you. And I'm glad you highlighted the interconnected nature of all of this. And that's something that we talked a little bit about at the end of this section. And it's just looking ahead to when we're bringing 311 online, when we're bringing the integrated priority dispatch system, that we should be looking at those and the impacts of those programs on our other calls, on canceled calls, calls for BOIC and police as well. So, looking ahead to, so kind of keeping with this theme of how the evidence is showing us that demand for emergency response is changing, the next slide offers an illustration of how this nature may be changing and what we can learn more about that. So the map you see is actually a preliminary analysis done by the Bureau of Emergency Communications. And the map really suggests that 911 calls with a nexus to homelessness have been increasing over the last several years. The analysis also tells us that the majority of 911 calls that are coded as having a nexus to homelessness generate a police bureau response. So those are two things from this sort of nascent analysis that the Bureau has reported to us. It's very much an early effort to understand the issue, to get our arms around the issue. And the methodology that BOIC is using certainly lacks precision. It's currently evolving. It's really a beginning stage of collecting data in this area. We wanted to bring it up with you today, not so much that we have definitive evidence of, what to do next, right? But because this analysis actually helps us point to further ways that we can refine our data collection in this area. And so one way I wanted to highlight today is that the Fire Bureau, as you probably know, has a validation key where first responders that arrive at a call can mark whether or not they have observed that the person related to the call is experiencing homelessness. So it's essentially a validation key for the dispatch coding. However, the Police Bureau does not have a corresponding validation mechanism. They do have a mechanism to identify calls as having a mental health component. So one opportunity is as we're going in, establishing a new call tracking system with the Police Bureau within the region coming online in the next few years, might there be an opportunity to introduce such a validation case so that we have sort of corresponding data collection from all of our public safety agencies that are working on this issue?
I do think that's going to be a bigger conversation because as BOAC rolls out the new call protocol, it will start with the ambulance, AMR, and it will start with fire, but police won't be a part of that. And it makes sense that as we are rolling out this system, that we would have all our first responders utilizing the same kind of protocol. But we didn't, it would have taken too long, we'd have been too delayed to actually bring police along initially. But it will make sense for us as we move forward to actually do that coordination. So I hope that's a bigger conversation with this council.
Well, I also note in the report about the embedded sergeant that you've had the pilot project from the police
Yes.
Monday through Friday, which is 10,000 calls that didn't get dispatched at all because the sergeant was able to explain why. So
Right.
that certainly seems like something we should add a position to do that round the clock, 24/7.
Good bang for the buck.
Yeah.
It does sound like that is having an impact, as are a multitude of things that we're trying, right? We're trying new ideas and new opportunities as we try to get over this crisis that we're in. So, yeah, thank you for that.
Great. So really throughout this section, both in terms of the improved response times and the changing nature of the calls. We're looking towards, we have a budget guidance to develop a consensus public safety budget, right? And I think that is an opportunity to take a look at not only new programs that we anticipate to come online, but also existing programs. And what are our outcomes? Are there areas where we can do less or do more and really achieve, the results that we're looking for in terms of community safety?
So were you not planning to talk about police today?
So we just chose to highlight the some overall key themes. I think the way that police is talked about in the report is there's a discussion about crime rates, there's a discussion about their response times and the embedded sergeant, and then there's a brief discussion around gun violence reduction program.
And that's actually where I had some questions, because I noticed that we've added personnel to what used to be the gang enforcement unit, and we have removed some people from the sex crimes unit to work on the gun violence reduction team, as well as some patrol officers. It sounds like we have also increased overtime by $200,000 based on this new model of doing bullet analysis. When you think about the fact that the police is so underfunded, where was this decision made that we were going to invest so much time and energy on bullets that would then go through a national process rather than, because as I look at the crime data chart, it shows that we're really at the bottom of the scale when it comes to violent crime. So there's a huge decision was made outside of this body, and this body continues to be told that we're desperately short of police officers. And so when I see the amount of staff that's been added and the amount of overtime, I can't help but want to have questions and answers about that.
So I believe some members of the Police Bureau are here today and can speak about the programmatic decision-making aspects and the benefits of the program. We highlighted it in our report because it has been an issue, an area of priority for council, and because it was a conscious decision to focus on a new model. But there wasn't necessarily a recommendation there. There is some initial tracking.
Could I make a suggestion? We could have that conversation here today, but we have work sessions that are actually scheduled now on these subjects. And with your forbearance, could we do that, unless these guys want to jump right now, could we hold off until the work sessions and then they will be prepared? They've heard the questions that you've just asked, and they're good questions, but let's have them go do their research and then come back as part of the work sessions we're scheduling around. I think we have one on GVRT, one on SRO, body-worn cameras, and something else that I forgot about.
Traffic enforcement.
Thank you, traffic enforcement. And so why don't we plan on discussing it in that context? If that's, does that square with you?
I would be fine with that, provided that we actually have enough time to do it. Because, Mayor, I wanted to co-host the work session on body-worn cameras, and I noticed that it's scheduled in conjunction with the gun violence reduction team. And so I hope we can work to figure out how to make sure that we give each of these subjects the time necessary, because I think I have a different perspective, as you know, on body-worn cameras, and would love us to have that full conversation.
Yeah, I would love to have that conversation, and I think a work session's the right place to do that. And so we'll, who is actually doing the body-worn camera? Ryan, is that you? Who's doing the presentation?
Chief Davis, myself, and program manager.
Okay, could you make sure somebody reaches out to Commissioner Hardesty's office, and then we'll have all the questions and all the issues in advance on the table and ready and teed up to discuss. And that's probably the best way to get it done. All right, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I'd just like to add, I'm also happy to wait for those work sessions, but I want an answer to a question I've been asking every year since I got here, which is, what is the rationale or method for determining the adequate police staffing? And in addition to that, how those resources are allocated within the Bureau. I've asked it every year. I've never gotten a satisfactory answer. And it makes it very difficult for me to support asks from the police bureau when I'm offered no rationale.
And speaking of questions for the record, I'll add one more. And this goes to what Commissioner Udaley just said. I think to elaborate a bit. So last week, I was on my way home, saw 6, 7 police cars. Of course, I stopped. Of course, I went over to ask what's going on. And I was told that there was a shoplifter, right? 7 police cars, lights blasting, street closed off. And I thought, whoa, shoplifter? And I was told, well, yes, they pushed a loss prevention specialist as they were leaving. I was also told that the person had a warrant out for their arrest. The lieutenant that I talked to was very nice, very respectful, not a problem. But I have to tell you, in that moment, I thought, wow, we're this short on cops, and we have 7 police cars here arresting one little woman who shoplifted from Target. Is that really how we deploy our limited resources? And so just want that on the public record so that as we get into these work sessions around policing, know that I think that we're all going to want to have a real robust discussion. And I'm hoping that it will be done without defensiveness, because this is really about having limited resources and making sure that we're investing them in the most appropriate way possible. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and if you can get the specific date and time for that incident, then we'll know what the call was that went out through BOEC, because it sounds to me like it could have been a potential backup situation, but I'll let you guys figure that out.
Okay. All right. So we're going to turn to the second to last section, which is maintaining the city's critical infrastructure. So this also is not new information to you. I am going to just... It's still a little frightening. I am not going to spend as much time on it because it is not new information, but that should not be perceived to mean that it is not important. This is what I believe to be one of the most critical financial risks facing the city, is our major maintenance and infrastructure backlog. So we currently have an annual repair, rehabilitation, and replacement funding gap. That's the amount of money it would take to get all of our assets up to sort of the desired condition, of almost $428 million annually. We have 69% of the city's assets in fair or better condition. This is down from a high of 76% in 2013. But what I want to talk a little bit about with you today is we've talked a lot over the last few years in the spring work session around the dollars, and certainly funding is extremely important. But what we talk about in the report is a little bit more of the operational challenges, because it's not just funding challenges that we have in our infrastructure bureaus. We have some operational challenges to meeting the infrastructure needs. So, Portland Parks and Recreation, as we know, has a $450 million maintenance backlog. And they also have, fewer staff than a lot of our infrastructure, our, ratepayer-funded infrastructure bureaus, to do the condition assessment, to do sort of the maintenance work. There's operational challenges as well. The report talks a little bit about their capital throughput. It's not clear how quickly they're able to get projects out the door because of some of our, because of how complex some of these projects are and the many processes that are involved with getting a capital project actually to completion. So that's a potential challenge that we can look towards addressing more. The facilities division within the Office of Management and Finance has significant needs for condition assessment and for just the broad data to tell them what assets really need and which should be prioritized. So there's a lot of operational needs that we can really drill into and focus on. There's been some significant movement on the part of the Capital Asset Manager Group, the CAMG, and we do plan on coming back to you with another work session to talk more about that in the future. So I want you to know there's work happening and more to come on this issue area. I also don't want to gloss over the fact that we have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in this, in city resources and in voter-approved resources over the last few years. And so we are making progress, but there's definitely more that needs to be done. For our last section, I'm going to turn it back over to our last couple of sections. Turn it
Very close
I'm just
here.
gonna, turn it back
Yeah.
over to Shannon to close us out.
Can see the light. Great. So we talked a little bit about the city's efforts around sustainability and resiliency, and clearly Portland continues to be a leader in this area amongst cities in the nation and even globally. So that's evidenced by our participation in the American Cities Climate Challenge Grant. It's evidenced by being part of the C40 Declaration. That said, despite all that, and really it's a confluence of different factors, and many of them external to what we've been doing as a city. We've seen stagnation across our environmental goals, right? So that's the one you see pictured here is the progress on carbon reduction. So it's the per person carbon emissions. It actually increased from below. We track it as compared to 1990 levels. It's a little bit of a wonky measure, but it had been going in the correct direction for a while. And then we actually saw an increase in emissions per person in FY 18-19. So that's unfortunate, and that's something that we hope to, when we look at the new efforts to address environmental sustainability that are local, including the Clean Energy Fund. What we'd like to see is we'd like to see urgency around development of measures and to begin collecting data on the sort of efficacy and the impacts of those programs. So we also talk.
As a
Yeah, go
data
ahead.
geek, it's really weird to look at a chart that shows 5 years at a consistent level. I mean, I guess when I first looked at that, I went, well, 4 years, right, at 41% reduction.
Mm-hmm.
When I looked at that initially, I was like, was that a typo, or was it really not 42, not 40, but 41 4 years in a row?
You know, it's one of those measures. I'd probably have someone from the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability come up so I can speak more precisely to the measure. But what I would say, this is certainly what I consider to be a population level metric. So you probably heard a little bit about population level measures when you worked on results-based accountability for equity. So it's really high level outcome that we're trying to impact with a variety of different efforts, right? And then it's also impacted by who's moving here, what types of transportation they're choosing, that sort of thing. But I think if we are serious about continuing to make progress on climate and on sustainability, then we need to figure out if what we're doing is working, right?
Right. Does this really make sense? Because if you think about a population change between 14, 15, and 17, 18, that was pretty significant, right? And so when I look at the same numbers across the board, it just makes me suspicious is all.
Right, that's fair.
And I'm just going
Go
to
ahead.
chime in for just a second. So I think that also, there's been a lot of conversation. I know the mayor had a press release last week. This, again, is one of the hindrances of looking backwards to last year. There's a lot of work that is happening either right now or is about to start happening that we actually won't see in the data for a few years, right? So our recommendation, again, is just really focused on making sure that we set up the systems to be able to, when we get that data, we know why we're seeing what we're seeing, and we can pivot and make changes to maximize the investments.
Great. So, in the interest of time, let's just talk a little bit about effective government. So this is our last section. So we want to highlight some of the successes that we saw in both internal services and customer-facing services for bureaus that were essentially applying the tools of process improvement and performance management to what the services that they're providing. So one area, and this is what you see graph there, is that the city actually reduced our turnaround times for fulfilling public records requests. So we received over 32,000 public records requests. 75% of those go to the police bureau. But we actually reduced that backlog for records requests from 16 weeks in 2015, sort of a high, to between 3 and 4 weeks by the end of this last fiscal year. So that's a pretty impressive improvement over that time. And it's really done by setting goals, ensuring that the appropriate staff are, working on this issue, and then through some other areas where we're essentially managing the records requests in a different way.
I have a question about that. Did we change the rules? Are we still charging people for public records requests? Did we change? Did we do something different?
We talked about that a little bit. So there has been a change, and sorry, I'm looking it up. Right. So, so this is one where, and it was over. I don't know if it was exactly last year, but we have made changes in recent years to essentially reduce the fees on the public, right? And prior to 1819. Internally, BTS was actually, our Bureau of Technology Services, was utilized to perform records request searches, and that bureau was charging between $160 to $180 to customer bureaus for
Charge
doing
a
that.
small fortune for everything.
So the kind of the improvement here was that BTS and the city's attorney's office came up with a better way to do that and a more efficient way to do the records, to conduct the records request, which is less costly. And so we've been able to both reduce the costs internally, but also reduce the cost to the public. So we're not necessarily incurring a bunch of costs that we're not.
So I
able
thought
to
there was
charge.
a directive because my understanding was that it was taking people a very long time to get information, say if they had a car accident, to get copies of the report for them to file. Did I dream that we said we were no longer going to charge people for those services?
We have implemented that. There's
Mm-hmm.
no longer a charge for your.
Okay, so I didn't dream that up. Good. I was like, maybe I just dreamed about it. And so it would be helpful to know what people can get for free as it relates to public records. And I know there's a big difference between companies who want public records, right, and individuals who are trying to be made whole based on something that happened to them.
Right.
So I would like to have more information about who do we charge and how do we charge and how do we decide who we're charging for what?
Great. So again, that wasn't the only win that we noted in the report. We actually saw improvement on commercial, so from Bureau of Development Services and their work with the other development review bureaus, actually improvement on commercial review times across a number of different measures. That was good to see. That certainly there's been changes in the development market, but it could also be attributed to the progress on implementation of the POPs program or the technology that's coming online to support development review. And then last but not least, saw some significant improvement in procurement services. So that division began tracking cycle times for procurements across a range of contract types, and that allowed the Bureau to develop customer service level agreements with other bureaus, and we're anticipate seeing improvements there as well, which will help the city across the board. So I just want to conclude there, and this is something where what we saw in putting together this report is that there's really some significant successes where bureaus have embraced performance management and essentially using data to improve their operations. And what we see is this has a lot of potential for citywide improvement as well. So Portland as a city for many years has collected and reported on performance data, and that gives us a foundation to actually improve our results, not only bureau by bureau in operations, but actually between bureaus on our big issues and as a city as a whole. Transitioning to that type of a system where we're actually using data to advance citywide goals will require a few things, honestly. It will require more investment in data management. And this is probably an issue that you've heard about from multiple bureaus, but it's difficult for bureaus to improve operations together using data if they don't have any way to share that data. It's an incredible challenge right now if we want to work on anything that sort of plays outside the lines of bureau operations, right? Of a bureau by bureau approach. If you think about it, if you're a manager of a program and you have all the information on that program at your fingertips on your, say, on a spreadsheet on your network drive or in a database that your bureau owns. Once you start expanding that program and it's a multi-bureau program, it's something where you're partnering really closely maybe with Civic Life or with the Office of Equity doing community engagement, it becomes more difficult to share data about what you're doing or even know what other staff are doing on that program.
So that's the what, but why?
Why does it impact success?
Why is it so difficult to work across the bureau boundaries and share the data?
We have different systems that we use throughout the city. Bureaus use different technology systems, they use different practices, they house their data in different places.
Yep, and really the other thing there, the next step on that is sort of a mundane step, which is that we don't have, the other reason why is that we don't have a citywide data inventory, which is a pretty foundational component of information that staff can work with, right? So when we look at this performance data, this is a data set that the City Budget Office collects from across bureaus, and that's why it's so unique. But if we had a data inventory of the actual raw data that we can work with, that gives us much more disaggregated view on what's happening. It gives us a lot more that we can work with to actually make improvements. And that's really the why. We need to develop better tools for staff to work together across bureau lines. One is a data inventory. Others are other things you've heard about, a software platform that we would either develop or procure that would enable us to share data. So it's a performance presentation, so I just wanted I want to note that because it is a really important next step for the city to be able to actually improve our results. Other areas that are going to be important to, again, improving results as a city, setting goals is important. So we've set targets and we've covered those. We've talked today about our performance versus those targets. In some areas, we know that we need to adjust targets or start looking at different outcomes that more fully capture the results that we're hoping to achieve for the community. I think there's another opportunity is to really identify what areas are going to be city priorities in the near term. So where do we actually want to make progress? If we are trying to make progress on all of these goals, then it's going to be a lot more difficult to move the needle on any of them. The last thing that I want to note today is just really providing bureaus more support for performance and innovation. So in areas where we've seen successes, it's typically in larger bureaus that have teams of their own analysts and they have systems of their own that they can work with. Small bureaus are increasingly being left behind in that equation. So if we want to support all bureaus or we want to work as a city on these issues, we need to have more centralized support, people that can do performance analytics, maybe they can do evaluation, apply behavioral insights. There's a lot of modern ways that we can use our information that some small bureaus simply don't have access to because they don't have the ability to hire their own team of analysts. So, and frankly, it wouldn't make that much sense. So that even lends to things like process improvement, which I know has been of interest to a lot of bureaus, getting training for their staff on process improvement. That's something that a centralized function could do. So,
When you say small bureaus, are you referring to bureaus with small staffs or bureaus with small budgets? What are you referring to?
Really both. I guess it's a not a terribly precise term, but there is what we see as a budget office when we're looking at what's happening inside of bureaus and inside of operations it's both, right? So it's a bureau with.
Let's use your bureau as an example. You are the budget office, so you play a critical role in the city, but you're a small bureau, are you not?
We're small. We're small in terms of both our staff and our budget.
So you believe that our budget office is shortchanged on data analytics?
Well, it prevents us from, for example, being able to have a platform for, I've talked about our city's use of Tableau Server here with this council a couple of times. So that's our, the analytics platform of choice for a lot of bureaus. So a bureau like the Police Bureau can purchase and utilize its own server, and that means that that analysts that are working for the Police Bureau can share their data analytics with managers and decision makers from the bureau, and all the way, to even to operational staff as well. So versus a bureau like the Budget Office, where we can produce dashboards, but we don't have a platform on which to share them because we're not big enough to buy it ourselves.
I would add that, our bureau is a little unique because we're a bureau full of analysts. So analytics is a little bit what we already do. So it's relatively easy for us to take on some sort of analytical additional task. And in addition, the reason why we have this report today is because council gave us resources to hire Shannon. And so we didn't have a performance management analyst until about 4 or 5 years ago. So that is both, right? And a fact that we have staff in-house that already sort of have this as part of our core work that we do, but also because because we got additional resources to do this work.
That's helpful.
I agree with that, and I think a better example might be the Office of Equity and Human Rights, with 13 people who they don't have a dedicated person to do the tracking of the data. So then everybody, that becomes part of their job, but the main part of their job is the training, the accountability, various other things.
That's helpful, thank you.
So, we've come to the end of the presentation. There are a couple slides here that just overview our recommendations. I'm not going to walk through them. You've heard most of them, but they're there for your reference. We have a little bit of time here. I think actually we got a lot of the information I was hoping to get throughout the presentation, but if there's anything else that you'd like to add or talk through with regard to findings that you found surprising, compelling, things you agreed with, didn't agree with, what additional performance data you would find useful for decision-making? I heard a lot of different indicators and sort of informational gaps you felt like existed around people experiencing houselessness, some additional information you were looking for in other areas as well. Anything else related to that that could help us sort of frame your budget decision-making in next spring?
I appreciate the report. I hadn't had a chance to read it ahead of time, so I'm going to be delving into it because I think this should form some of the basis for our budget discussions and our budget presentations. And then each of the bureaus looking again at, are the performance metrics that we put forward however many years ago, are they still the right ones?
Right.
I just want to say I really appreciated the mayor's directive in the last budget to have the first responder bureaus all working together, looking for cooperative savings. If we're successful in moving that work forward into the next year, I think that is an excellent model to think about what other bureaus does the work coexist, whether or not the commissioners has it all in their portfolio, right? Where are the other nexus where we could bring bureaus together and have them do a similar kind of process? Because I do believe that there's efficiencies, and especially if you're working on like kind of efforts and doing that work more collaboratively and not duplicating stuff just because it's a different bureau. So I look forward to your help in helping us as we continue this process to really be thoughtful about, so what's the bureaus that come next, right? And what's the nexus to bring that collaboration together?
Yeah, this is a really good point. And there's been some great examples, the work Commissioners Fish and Fritz did around BES and parks, for example. That was a huge improvement, I think, over the way things had been done previously. The work we've done around customer service, the work around permitting, bringing all the different permit bureaus together. There's still some obvious needs. We spent a little bit of time talking today about technology and software platforms and data analytics. I feel that that's still a huge weakness internally to the organization. I'm excited actually about the work that's being done collectively by the public safety bureaus, and I know they're going to have some recommendations for us in the short term, which I think will give us some early wins and a good start on that.
Great.
I agree with everything my colleague said. I think my biggest frustration around the budget process you already know, which is that it's just been really hard to get to those inefficiencies and redundancies and opportunities to share resources or at least standardize practices across all the bureaus when the bureaus are spread, out between the five of us. I do think there's a lot of opportunity for improving efficiency and saving money and being collaborative. And technology remains a really big sticking point for me.
Back to the technology question. I remember when I first got here, I said to Tom, so why do we have the people who buy the computers not be the people who use the computers, right? Or vice versa? It would be great if we had some kind of standards around technology purchases so that we don't have people without the technical expertise, actually the ones purchasing the computers that then someone else will figure out doesn't work as intended. There have been too many oops around computer purchases in the city of Portland consistently. And so it would be great if we either had a one-stop place that actually reviewed all technology contracts, or they were all purchased under one person who had expertise in technology. I don't know what the answer is, but I certainly want to have the conversation so that we don't so that we make good decisions when it comes to the technology that we're buying and that it's going to serve the purpose that we intended to serve.
I'd love to respond to that. Actually, that's good timing because there was a budget note last year to streamline and to have presented a better strategy for our procurement process for technology services. And there's some work underway currently as part of our What Works Cities partnership, where we're working with an expert on contracting. And that consultant's actually bringing together both our procurement services and technology services. And they're basically coming up with strategies that will help align those two teams. So I know that I don't want to, speak and give too much away, but I know that information is, we're planning to present that to council in 2020. Yeah,
It's going to be a busy year.
absolutely.
Busy beats all the alternatives.
Yeah, amen to that.
Thank you for the engaging discussion today. I look forward to working with
Thank you
you.
for sticking with us for 2 hours of graphs.
It was great. Thank you.
2 hours of
All right,
captivating
we're adjourned.
conversation.